So now I'd like to move to the second main topic here, which is the history of this word from its origins in ancient Greece to the present day. So between about 600 BC, that is 2,600 years ago, when this word started to be used in this way in ancient Greece, to about 1700 AD, so about 300 years ago. For that long period of time, philosophy is often used in a manner that is synonymous with theoretical science, as I mentioned previously, and with general inquiry or education. So the whole project of philosophy is basically the project of inquiry for its own sake, or fundamental inquiry, or inquiry into the nature of things. And this is really synonymous in many cases with what we would today call theoretical science. An interesting thing to note as well is that in what's sometimes called the Middle Ages, so roughly 500 AD to 1500 AD, the word also begins to acquire another signification, which is it implies knowledge that's acquired naturally or rationally. That is, knowledge that has to do with the natural world, or knowledge that's acquired by human reason and human experience of the natural world, rather than knowledge that's acquired supernaturally, or knowledge of supernatural things. The idea there, the reason why that kind of association picks up, is because a number of thinkers in the Middle Ages who are interested in philosophy and write about philosophy are also part of a very strong religious tradition. So you think about, for instance, the Catholic Church in Europe in the Middle Ages was very strong politically, very important intellectually, and basically, almost everyone affiliated in Europe at the time affiliated with the Catholic Church, partly because if you didn't, then you would be a heretic and you would get in serious trouble, but also because many people were just convinced that was the way a lot of people saw the world at that time. So people who write about philosophy, they make a distinction between the kinds of knowledge in this period, the Middle Ages. They made a distinction between the kind of knowledge that we have from, for instance, sacred documents like the Bible, and knowledge that we have by reasoning and reflecting and by observing things, which is knowledge we have through philosophy. And these thinkers were also aware of the ancient Greeks, and that the ancient Greeks, for instance, didn't believe in the Hebrew God or in Jesus of Nazareth, because they never met or knew Jesus of Nazareth, for one thing. But they also recognized that those ancient Greek philosophers had a lot of very good ideas, that they were right about a lot of stuff. And so the way that they kind of reconciled that contrast, if God is sort of the source of knowledge through the Bible, but the ancient Greek philosophers were also able to acquire a lot of knowledge when they didn't know anything about that God or the Bible. How is that possible? Their way of reconciling that contrast is to distinguish two kinds or modes of knowledge. One mode of knowledge is one we have by revelation, or through like religious texts and authority of religious figures, and maybe also through some kind of direct contact with God. But another kind of knowledge is one that we have philosophically, or we have through natural means, through just our own human reason. This is a kind of knowledge that would be available to all people, regardless of whether they had ever read the Bible or heard about Jesus, and so on. And so, again, the word philosophy acquires that additional connotation at this time. One more point I want to make about this quickly is that for much of this period, the Western tradition, the Greeks and the Europeans, and the Arabic tradition, the Northern African, Egyptian, and Middle Eastern tradition that becomes the Ottoman Empire, that these two traditions are in a lot of dialogue with one another, and both of these traditions receive texts from the ancient Greeks. And so the knowledgeable people, the scientists and scholars in both the Arabic world and in the European world are studying a lot of the same texts from Aristotle and Plato and other philosophers in ancient Greece, and scientists and mathematicians. And so there's a very common set of things that happen in both traditions. Philosophy, again, is associated both with general learning and theoretical science, but it's also associated with a more kind of natural or rational mode of knowledge, in contrast with a more supernatural or revealed kind of knowledge. Because, as you may know, in the Arabic tradition, religion at this time, religion is also very influential. Of course, it's Islamic religion, starting by about 700 AD. The Islamic religion is sort of the official religion. And so there's a kind of assumption among many of the learned people, scholars, and so on, that religious tradition is correct, but they also want to carve out a place for philosophical knowledge and the kind of knowledge that was acquired by the ancient Greek philosophers and scientists. So a very similar pattern going on both in the Arabic world and in Europe at this time. So I just wanted to flag that because it is of some interest and importance. Now, around 1600 to 1800, this is a very strong period of what we could call the scientific revolution, at least, taking place a little bit earlier than 1600, or beginning a bit earlier than 1600, and continuing on really to the present day in a way. This is a very strong period for the growth of science in Europe and in other places in the world too, but in Europe, there starts to be developed a designation, natural philosophy. And this basically describes what we would today call scientists. These are people who want to be philosophical about nature and how nature works. They want to study and arrive at fundamental principles, a synoptic understanding of how nature works. So, and some of these people begin to do experiments as part of their way of trying to settle these questions. So there's a tradition known as natural philosophy, and people who call themselves and call each other natural philosophers. One famous example of this is in the title of Isaac Newton's big book about physics. You all know Isaac Newton probably from any physics you've ever taken. You've learned about Newton and Newton's laws, first law of motion, second law of motion, and so on. The title of Newton's book, where he laid out those laws and presented his big theory about the force of gravity and how it explains the movements of bodies in space as well as on Earth. This book was called I'm going to make the Latin sound kind of funny accidentally, but Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, basically mathematical principles of natural philosophy. So Newton's book, where he presents his physics, he's describing as a contribution to natural philosophy. Again, this is just an example to show that at this time, the word philosophy was used to refer to stuff that we today would probably classify as science. And in the 1800s, William Whewell coins a new word for that kind of inquiry. He calls people who do that kind of inquiry scientists. So the word natural philosophers starts to be replaced with the word scientist. And the word scientist implies not just a general study of nature in terms of fundamental principles and a kind of synoptic approach, but it also implies the use of experiments. So as the use of experiments becomes more and more a kind of defining part of what this tradition of natural philosophy itself is, the use of experiments, and I should probably also say the use of more and more complex mathematics, as that becomes more and more a kind of defining feature, then there starts to be a kind of separation, at least in terms of the language, between what is called philosophy and what's called science. And so around this time, you start to see a kind of splitting off of science from philosophy. And in the late 19th century, there's the formation of a new scientific discipline called psychology, which is supposed to be the science of the psyche or the mind, mental stuff. And this discipline breaks away from philosophy and associates itself with the sciences, calls itself one of the sciences. Before this time, what we today call psychology really was a part of philosophy. And so if you read books from the 1600s and 1700s that are on topics like perception, sensation, memory, and so on, which are like classic topics in psychology and psychological research, those books in the 1600s and 1700s were written by people who called what they were doing philosophy. And we'll read some of that stuff, actually. We'll read David Hume, who called what he was doing philosophy, but today we might classify some of that work as psychology, or early cases of psychology. So what we have here is a kind of story where philosophy is originally inclusive of lots of different fields, including, what we today would call physics and psychology. But gradually over time, some of those fields have split off and become their own independent fields that are no longer described by their practitioners as a subdiscipline of philosophy or a part of philosophy. And so that raises the question of, well, what is philosophy left with? Maybe philosophy is the mother of many of these disciplines, is kind of the originator of lots of different research traditions and programs. But as each of those research traditions and programs has gone off and started on its independent line and has acted like it no longer needs philosophy, then that might, leave the mother, philosophy, kind of lonely and kind of empty. Like maybe there's nothing left for philosophy herself to do.